we'll go for it. So this talk from country lad to upstart crow was a talk that I wrote 6 years ago for our annual birthday celebrations for Shakespeare. And I was fascinated by, well, I've always been fascinated about what made Shakespeare Shakespeare. And we know so little about him. I'll say a little bit about that in a moment. But like all of us, it must be those formative years of his life that shaped so much, because that's what it does for us. And Shakespeare, at the end of the day, was only human, and must have had the same influences and the same thoughts, dreams, desires, fears that we must have done. So that's where this talk originated, and that's where it came from. And over time, I've added bits to it. And a couple of years ago, I walked from Stratford to London the Shakespeare way, and that informed a little bit more about my thoughts about him, and of course, all the other research and reading that I've done. So tonight is an introduction, really, and we're going to set the scene for the arrival of this child of fancy in 1564. Life's but a shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is the tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Well, the writer of those words said he didn't leave us with nothing. 38 plays, 154 sonnets, 3 poems, and some 1,700 new words and phrases. Things like assassination, verb, frugal, lovely, majestic, foregone conclusion, catch a cold, leapfrog, naked truth. It's probably no wonder then that Shakespeare has he's the most quoted source in the Oxford English Dictionary, with over 33,000 entries. The next to him is the Bible, with 8,000 less. 64 million, that's 50% of the world's children study him in school. And 2 of his plays, Hamlet and Much Ado About Nothing, have been translated into Klingon, incredibly. In 2017, the Stratford-upon-Avon newspaper, the Stratford Herald, cited that Shakespeare's contribution to the local economy was some £600 million, which also supports 11,000 jobs and 100 million tourists. And then you add into it all of the performances, the thousands of performances on stage and screen worldwide every day, and it begins to become rather staggering. But why is he so important? Why has he endured? What is so fascinating about this guy? Alexander Dumas, the author of The Three Musketeers, said, "After God, Shakespeare created most." And I think that's a really, really apt description, because his plays touch on every conceivable human emotion, as well as every possible permutation of the situations in which those emotions can occur. You know, he puts into the mouths of kings and queens the same fears, ambitions, desires that also afflict lovers, maids, teachers, barkeepers, weavers, doctors, priests, mothers, children, gardeners, and anyone, in fact, who is human. You know, we as audience members, we laugh and we cry and we fear and we champion these creations because ostensibly they're us. It's us there up on stage. We've all felt the same pangs of first love as Romeo and Juliet. We've all questioned what on earth we're doing, like Hamlet does. We've all had to hide at times, perhaps what we're feeling, like Viola in Twelfth Night. We've all dreamed of being something else, like Malvolio does. And, you know, we've all probably at some point, you know, used the same manipulations or similar manipulations or persuasions that Richard III or Cassius employ. And if we've not, then we've almost certainly seen it in other people. So these plays, themes, and their emotions are universal. And because at the end of the day, Shakespeare's plays are not just about those kings and queens or those battles and those shipwrecks, or lost letters, love letters. They're about the human condition, which has never changed. Love is not love, which alters when its alteration finds. What light is light, if Sylvia be not seen? The fault, dear Brutus, is not in our stars, but in ourselves. No legacy is as rich as honesty. There is no darkness but ignorance. All the world's a state. You could quote these all night, these truths about the human condition. Ben Jonson, Shakespeare's fellow playwright, wrote in the introduction to the first folio of the complete works in 1623, that his friend was not of an age, but for all time. In the same year, a monument was erected in Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon to their local boy, who's made good, possibly paid for by his theatre friends and colleagues. So within 7 years of his death in 1616, this Glover's son from a sleepy little town in the middle of England was being immortalized. His genius not only being recognized by scholars, but perhaps more importantly by his peers and his co-professionals. But who really was this genius, this soul of the age, as Ben Jonson called it? Part of our fascination, I think, with Shakespeare is also that we just don't know who he is, his elusiveness. In their book, The Shakespeare Conspiracy, Graham Phillips and Martin Keatman demonstrate with great detail the sparsity of the knowledge that we actually have about Shakespeare, despite the fact, and they pick up on this, that it's interesting that he has given his name, or his name has been given to an entire era of history, which is only usually reserved for monarchs and emperors. But in truth, we know very little about him, and all that we can decipher, or that we like to decipher, is from of his own thoughts, his opinions, his feelings, are all conjectural, because there's only 79 handwritten documents that bear his name, and only 6 of those have his signature, and all 6 of them come from the four final years of his life, and everything else we cannot help but go back to those 38 plays, 154 sonnets, poems, and all those words and phrases that he's created. Now, some things, of course, we do know. There are some facts. He was baptized on the 26th of April, 1564. He died on the 23rd of April, 1616. He owned the second largest house, New Place, in Stratford. He was an actor. He was a writer. He was a housekeeper or shareholder of 2 theatres. He was a king's man. He was a player by royal appointment, if you like. He took a lease on a London apartment. He was reported a number of times for evading tax and also for not keeping the peace. And he purchased land in and around Stratford. But there's not much more than that about his life. There is a bit more, but not very much in terms of the big headlines. And so, like all geniuses, though, he started life like us, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms. And he was not born great, nor did he have greatness thrust upon him, like us. And much of that appetite to achieve one's dreams, therefore, and ambitions must have come through the influence of his family, his home life, his parents, education, the formative years of childhood and adolescence that shape those dreams and ambitions which set us on the road to life. So over these next 8 weeks, we're going to go along along that road on a journey to find some of those things that would have informed Shakespeare in those early years, and hopefully where they crop up in his work. So we're going to look at the countryside, we're going to look at his family, we're going to look at the community, the entertainments, work, marriage, and those kind of things. But as I say, before we meet this child of fancy, we need to go back a bit further. We need to set the scene for his grand entrance onto the greatest stage of... One second. Oh, you get really dry mouth when you just continually talk. The brilliant historian Michael Wood, in his book In Search of Shakespeare, describes Will as being born on the cusp of history, and I think that's such a great way, a cracking way of describing this moment in our nation's history, the moment Shakespeare is born at this time. In 1564, Queen Elizabeth is only 25, and she's only been on the throne for 5 years. England, up to this point, has known 4 different rulers in 20 years, and 4 different agendas as well during that time. New worlds are being discovered in this moment, new discoveries in medicine, and physics are being made. The growth of the middle and the mercantile classes is starting to boom. Literacy is hugely increasing for both men and women. By the end of the century, 1600, around 400,000 people will be able to read, and 10% of those are women, which is a huge change from 1% at the beginning of the century. But everything in this moment, in the middle of this century, is tangible. Who knows what's going to happen next? And it's not until Will is 24 years old and the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 does England and Elizabeth's England start to have that sort of sense of security and control. And she is going to reign over the longest period of prosperity in the nation's history, many years. But at this moment when Shakespeare was born, no one knows that. And perhaps the biggest change that is being felt by everybody in Stratford, in the Shakespeare's household on Henley Street, is religion and the changes in religion. Now, it's probably a little harder for us to appreciate in our largely secular society in 2020 of the impact that these changes to religion have. Its traditions and its practices held everyday life together. Elizabeth's subjects had seen a country swing from one faith to another and back again within 1-2 generations. Imagine, to us, perhaps imagine financially going from decimalization to imperialism again, back to decimalization, and changing from a euro to a pound, all in the space of 20 years. It kind of, it's quite mind-boggling, and to us it would be confusing, painful, tiring, expensive, unpredictable. And that's probably the biggest danger, unpredictable. And so to those Elizabethans who are just becoming Elizabethans in 15, that's a huge thing to have to live with and to coming to terms with. What's going to happen next? What should I uphold? What do I invest in? The year following Elizabeth's accession, 1558, saw the establishment of the Church of England in 1559 and the acts of supremacy and uniformity. And the idea behind these was to try and give some sort of clarity to some of those questions. In doing so, the government were also trying to create a clean slate, if you like. So, for example, not only the use of new prayer books and changes to episcopal rules, but actually the places you went to every Sunday, which was a centre of your life, the church, was also physically changing. So brood screens were being removed, tabernacles, chalices being replaced with communion cups, images being taken away, and the brightly painted allegorical reliefs that would have illuminated churches were also being whitewashed. And in 1563, John Shakespeare, Shakespeare's dad, is ordered to do just that to the Guildford Chapel in Stratford upon Avon. Taking away those old stories of St. George and the Dragon and Thomas à Becket and the Last Judgment and all those sorts of stories, those picture stories that people would have grown up knowing. The government wanted to start afresh. It's interesting in The Winter's Tale, the shepherd at the turning point of the Winter's Tale, when on the shores of Bohemia, they find this baby wrapped in swaddling clothes, Perdita. The shepherd turns to his son and says, "Thou meetest with things dying, I with things newborn." And that sense of being again on the cusp of a change is, I think, really emulated in the world Shakespeare was being born into. But perhaps people like John also hedged their bets, because 400 years on now, many of these religious buildings are starting to reveal those wall paintings. And here in Guildford, St Mary's Church on Quarry Street has recently uncovered ceiling art in St John the Baptist Chapel. A couple of years ago, some of the red what do we want to call it, spines of the ceiling, they revealed these beautiful patterns on these spines, and so perhaps the whitewash wasn't so thick that it couldn't be removed at some point. Who knows what was going to happen next? So that's the religious part of it. That's the big changes going on. But what's the place like? What's the country like that Will's being born into? Well, let's think about his location. He's being born into the centre of the country, Middle England, Warwickshire, right in the centre of geographically in the country. It's deeply wooded, isolated farms and houses, a landscape rooted in the natural world of the seasons, plants, animals, and the farming year. When shepherds pipe on oaten straws and merry larks are ploughmen's clocks, when turtles tread on rooks and doors and maidens bleach their summer smocks, cuckoo then on every tree mocks married men. That's an extract from Love's Labour's Lost. It's the final song of the play, but that play is set in northern Spain. Didn't really sound like northern Spain, and that's a real key part of Shakespeare's writing, is that whether the characters are going to be in Spain, Italy, Egypt, Cyprus, Denmark, an island in the Atlantic or the Mediterranean, Shakespeare's English countryside is only a few steps away. And that home that he's describing there, that home for him was the town of Stratford upon Avon. Stratford, coming from an old Anglo Danish word, Stretford, literally the street across the ford, Stretford, the street across the river, Stratford upon Avon. In 1564, when Shakespeare was born, it's a fairly small town. It is a town. It's got about 1,500 people. During his life, 2,500 people. It's about 100 miles from London. It's very near Oxford. Oxford, probably its biggest city, that and Coventry, two big centres. The second largest city at this time in the UK, in England, is Norwich. Stratford, Worcester would have been larger, would have been around about the same size. The Bishop of Worcester basically owned that land. The Church of the Worcester Diocese owned the land of Stratford. We'll hear about that a little bit later when we find out about how Shakespeare gets his marriage deed. Like I say, it's 100 miles away from London. If you were to walk it, as I discovered 4 years ago this summer, It is about 150 miles away. If you're walking the lanes and the narrow pathways, as Shakespeare may have done, and I did. It took me 9 days non-stop. On a cart, on a horse, it'd probably take you about 3 or 4 days. And when Will is born, Stratford would look pretty much would have been looking pretty much as it had done for a good couple of 100 years. Big structural changes and stuff come into the town during his lifetime. In the 1590s, there are two very large fires that take place in the town in the last decade of the century, and a lot of big changes happened from that. But the town Shakespeare is born into is very similar to what he with what would have been there for the last couple of hundred years. It's largely made up of medieval buildings, hall houses. These are big properties where you've just got one large room, effectively, perhaps a little bit of a back room for sleeping in, but everything would have happened in one room with an earth floor, fire in the center, which you cooked and you sat around and so on. Maybe someone's workshop over in one corner. But these would have been large communal spaces for a whole family to live in. There would have been some brick houses. There would have been a few brick houses, some black and white, the wattle and daub classic sort of Tudor buildings that we know from school. Thatched outhouses, open air middens. Middens are toilets or waste pits. The original marketplace was still in use from 1196. You would have had Holy Trinity Church. You would have had the Guild Chapel, the Guild House. Sir Hugh Clopton's bridge, the only bridge spanning the River Avon. Hugh Clopton was like the second most important man in the town after the clergy. He would build a beautiful house called New Place, which Shakespeare later buys himself. And given its location, you would have felt the countryside on all sides. You're right on the northern tip of the Cotswolds in Stratford, and it would have therefore influenced Stratford's main form of business, which would have been the sale and production of wool and sheep farming. Pigs and cattle were also sold. You've got Sheep Street in the town just up from the Royal Shakespeare Theatre. And grazing pastures would have been just a stone's throw from the High Street. The Henley Street, where Shakespeare was born, the birthplace, would have been literally right on the edges of the outer part of the town at that time. An offshoot of all of that would have been the tanning industry as well. So that's where hides are made and turned into leather. The stink and the smell from tanning would have been pretty horrific. And it's an industry that Shakespeare's dad is involved with because he is a glover. And we'll learn a little bit more about him next week, turning leather into gloves. But it would have been a busy town. It would have been a busy, mercantile, small town where everybody knew everybody. The Greenaways, for example, are a merchant family. Now they take stuff that's made and produced locally, wool, leather, gloves, cheese, and so on. They take that to London and they bring back with them 3 or 4 days later, they're going to bring back with them dates and figs and rice and currants and the stuff that people would have been using, in their household. And of course, they would have brought stories with them. And we'll come on to the stories in another episode. But this was Stratford's touch with London, and the Greenaways lived only a few doors down from the Shakespeares on Henley Street. And those are the people we're going to meet in our next episode, the Shakespeares. So that's as far as we're going to get to tonight. We've gone about nearly 30 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed it. But before we finish, I'm going to have a look if there's any questions on our chat feed. No, it's not vodka. It was water. Though I do feel like in this big armchair, I should have some sort of, Shakespearean goblet of wine. We do not have a lot to remember. A lot of his plays were, in fact, Yes, there were a lot of edgy political jokes, and yes, there's a lot of those kind of references. I am going to live the man for now. Questions. If anybody has a quick question, I'm thinking, did they tell us what he did to disturb the peace? He is, no, not in an obvious sense. From what I can remember, he is bound over for keeping the peace by, now I need to look up the name, and it's to do with the theatre. There's quite a lot of the actors that Shakespeare ends up working with and knowing do end up in a lot of fights. Some of them do time in prison. Ben Jonson, for example, Ben Jonson kills a man. There are often fights and stuff going on in front of the theatres, outside the theatres. And that's one of the largest reasons why often theatres were seen as these places of danger, and why the law was so strict on them. But I will look into a little bit more of the actual specifics about the two disturbances to the piece that he's involved with. So I will have a little look into that for next week for you, so you've got a little bit more detail on that. Was there any formal theatre training in those days? How did one get into acting, into theatre? Well, that in a way is the million-dollar question of how did Shakespeare end up in the theatre? And I will touch on that in one of our in one of the final episodes of this, about how we think he may have got there. But quite often, from what we know, actors quite often apprenticed to other actors for a start. So, for example, Burbage's apprentice was with him for a long time, and in fact would sleep at the bottom of his bed. And so apprenticeships, you served a long time, so there's that element, and you would learn from your peers, very much like the old rep system in some respect. How you got into the theatre, how you suddenly said, I'm going to join the circus and go away. I mean, quite possibly it may have been someone noticed you had a skill playing an instrument, maybe turning up and asking for a job. There's no written, as far as I've read anyway, kind of stories of, I sent my CV along and I did an audition, and because actually Shakespeare's troupe were fairly small, and Shakespeare was writing for his company. So a lot of the characters that Shakespeare's writing, he's writing them for actors that he already knows and works with. When more characters are needed, they would hire in help. But the idea of going and holding audition, Henslow holding auditions on the Rose stage and asking for, can I see your Shakespeare, please? Have you got a song? I doubt whether they had people queuing around the block, but there may have been open auditions for people to join in. Who knows? It's something that I've not read about. It's something I don't know. It'd be an interesting one. But thank you for that question. Do we know if Shakespeare's ancestors came from Stratford too? Matt, yes, we do. And that's going to be the topic of next week's episode. It will be about the Shakespeares and the Ardens. So John, his dad, and his family, and Mary and her family will all be next week. And they would have all been living very close around the area of Is it known, Jane? Is it known when Shakespeare's family became gentry? Yes, in the sense that it's Shakespeare who does it. Shakespeare is the one who he applies. John, his dad, applies for a coat of arms to become a gentleman, it doesn't go anywhere. So Shakespeare actually applies for the coat of arms to be a gentleman. And his coat of arms is a yellow shield with an arrow, a spear through it, through the middle, and underneath it's non sans droit, is the Latin, not without right. So maybe there's something in that, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about that in a coming episode as well, about his gentrification that he had. Will there be a next time trailer? Oh, maybe I'll do a little next time trailer for you from the garden or something. Yeah, maybe I will let you know what's coming up. Folks, thank you so much for joining me this evening. I hope you enjoyed the first episode of From Country Lad to Upstart Crow. And I hope you'll join me next week when hopefully we'll be on time and we'll sort it out, and I'll sort out the streaming issues. And next week we're going to learn about the history of Shakespeare's family and the birth of this sweet distraction. That's a line from All's Well That Ends Well. Until then, keep safe, everybody. Keep well. Look after yourselves and your loved ones. And I'll see you all next week. Take care. Bye-bye.